This is the Everyday Economist, and today we're going to be looking at China's Middle East pivot recently with their growing influence in the region and some of the things they're doing there, and seeing what implications that has, not just for the global economy, but also geopolitics as we know it. So let's begin with a summary of what really happened recently. One of the bigger events that came out of the Middle East in the last few months was that China, acting as the middleman, brokered a peace deal between arch rivals in Beijing, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and really brought them together and opened diplomatic relations between the two countries after many years of hostilities, sometimes open hostilities, between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the region. Along with this agreement, Syria was allowed into the Gulf Cooperation Council since the start of their civil war, which is again a major development in the region, as Syria had previously been aligned to Iran, and because of that they were expelled by the other Sunni Arab countries. And Iran in return has promised to withdraw support from Yemen, especially the Houthis, and really stop causing problems on Saudi Arabia's southern border, because that has been a dagger in their back for many years now. They've been hitting their oil facilities, and they've been a lot of cross-border skirmishes and a lot of problems there that Iran is now promising to slow down and withdraw support from as a sign of extending the olive branch to Saudi Arabia. Now you might be wondering, why should anyone care about this? What is the significance of all of this? This is, yes, China's the middleman. This is between two countries that are important in the global stage, but they're not really superpowers. Well, it's important because the story here is more than just Iran and Saudi Arabia. It really is a watershed moment in the history of the region, as it signals the end of America's chapter in the Middle East. That really began in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq and then Afghanistan. And slowly but surely we've seen that with China coming in to the Middle East and really establishing close connections with all the key players there, on one hand, America's influence has been waning and declining on the other. And this was seen with their pullout from Iraq, their pullout from the JCPOA in terms of engaging Iran diplomatically, and also the fall of Kabul a few years ago when we saw that America really retreated from the region in full force. And this again created a void that China is now filling in. This is important because let's look at history. The 19th century, we could call it the British century in the region, but also around the world, but especially in the Middle East. The British were calling the shots there, even after World War I, well into the 20th century. But then after World War II, it was called the American century because the Americans had a great amount of influence in that region up to recently, and they still do. Let's not discount that. But now, in the 21st century, especially in the 2020s and onwards, it's really, I think, what historians are going to refer to from here on out. It's going to be the Chinese century, not just in the Middle East, but also globally. But the Middle East can provide valuable insights for the type of blueprint that China is contemplating regarding their intentions on the global stage beyond this region. Let's take a closer look. Now, this is something many viewers have emailed me about and asking, and that I refer to in my previous videos, why is America pulling out of the Middle East? Why is America no longer interested in the Middle East? That's something that a lot of people have been wondering. What really changed? Did something change at all, or is this something that differs president to president? Well, the answer is there's two main reasons why America is pulling out. And I think chief among those reasons is the simple fact that America today is an energy superpower. And I don't use that word lightly. They are energy independent. If you look at this graph on the left, we see that America now, for the first time in recent years, is exporting more energy than they are importing, which means that for the first time in America's history, they are no longer majorly dependent on outside forces and players for their energy needs. Not only are they self-reliant in their production of energy, they're also supplying the rest of the world, especially Europe. We see with when Russia was taken out of the picture, it was America who stepped up. And we can see on the graph on the left, this is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, that America's oil productions are almost double the daily production of Saudi Arabia. And they account for 20% of the total global oil production. This is not something to cough at. This is a major development that a lot of people, I guess, who ask these questions haven't paid attention to, or maybe don't realize the full gravity of, is that America no longer needs stability or key strategic relationships in the Middle East like they used to in fulfilling their energy needs. That's reason number one. This is a major development, and it's mostly because of the shale and fracking revolution that's really allowed America to tap into oil resources that they previously were not able to. But there's also another reason. And that other reason is essentially the de facto ending of the Quincy Agreement. If you don't know, the Quincy Agreement was an agreement signed, it was a secret agreement, as you can see, that was signed by President Roosevelt with King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, and it's called the Quincy because it was signed on top of USS Quincy in 1945. And this was really setting the foundation for the Cold War. The Allies, especially the Americans, knew the war was over, and they had to deal with the Russians, and the Soviets in particular, for the next century. So what the Americans did is they cut a deal with Saudi Arabia. They told the Saudi Arabians, we will guarantee military and military security of your country, but also of the royal ruling class family, if you in exchange can guarantee steady flows of oil back to the United States. And we saw in August of 1971 when the US went off the gold standard, the Quincy Agreement sort of evolved because no longer was the US dollar backed by gold, but the Saudi Arabians agreed to only sell their oil in US dollars to foreign countries. And that in turn legitimized the US dollar as a major currency on the global trade. So we see that the Quincy Agreement in fact is really de facto now. It's moot because of America's newfound energy independence, and this has serious ramifications for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not a fan of America becoming energy independent. Not only does it drive down oil prices, but it also removes any leverage of influence that the Saudis used to have with the Americans. But there's also another reason that I think is not getting as much attention as this one for why the United States is leaving the region. And that reason is, in the past 2 years, two new fronts have opened, new theaters of engagement for the Americans. On the left, we obviously see the Ukraine and Russia theater. So now America has to worry about what's going on in Ukraine. At the same time, there's been increasing tensions and hostility in the South China Sea, specifically in the Pacific, between China and Taiwan. So now America has opportunities to divest their interests, their strategic and their intelligence and their military capabilities away from the Middle East and towards other areas where they can get a bigger bang for their buck. Let's look at examples of Russia here. America, we hear on the news and a lot of people in the comments are saying America's wasting a lot of money on Ukraine. It's $300 million of new aid packages announced every few months that America's now sending $500 million to the Ukraine and all that. Well, let's see it from the perspective of Americans. I mean, that is a big number to see on a headline. But if you do the math, that's just close to 4 hours of America's total military budget in a year. So for 4 hours of America's military budget, they can stick it to the Russians. This is the best thing that has happened to the American military-industrial complex when it comes to dealing with Russia, because forever they've been itching to have a hot war with the Soviets and vice versa, but they couldn't, each of them, because of nuclear weapons that were entered into the equation. But now, for a fraction of the cost, which is basically nothing from the perspective of the Americans, $300 million is nothing. It's pennies for the American military budget. With those pennies, they're inflicting heavy losses on the Russians. They're defeating their greatest geopolitical and military rival. This is the dream of dreams for any Cold War president, but now it gets to be done by Joe Biden. That's why they like to remove their presence from the Middle East, because they're really not getting anything out of it. And now they're instead putting all that attention in the European theater. Same thing with Taiwan. They know that China is eventually going to have some sort of head-on conflict with Taiwan. So they want to make an example out of Ukraine out of Russia to tell the Chinese, we can do something similar to in your backyard if you go too far with Taiwan. And as a result, they've been investing a lot of resources, military intelligence and otherwise, in beefing up Taiwan. And these two reasons combined, both the attention of Americans being taken away and distracted by these two new campaigns, but also in line with their energy independence, are two of the main reasons why America is pulling out of the Middle East. But let's look at what that means for the Middle East and some of the implications it has for the remaining players in that region, including now China. So when we look at the Middle East and ask ourselves, okay, America pulled out, so what are the implications of that? What are the symptoms of America's absence in the Middle East? Now, the news might tell you, well, there's less stability, and these are the obvious answers, but in this channel, we want to be a little bit more sophisticated and in-depth. So let's look at some of the things that have been happening in the Middle East. We see some sort of forced peace between the Arab countries and Israel. And I say forced, yes, some of those countries like the UAE is legitimate, but it wasn't a hurried peace. It wasn't rushed. They didn't rush to the table to sign this peace deal. What happened here was that Israel and these Gulf countries have a common enemy, which is Iran. When America pulled out, they realized that they can no longer rely on the Americans for their defensive capabilities of keeping Iran contained. As a result, the remaining players, even though they had their own hostilities historically, the Arabs and the Israelis, they realized, wait a minute, we got to work together now. America's no longer here. We got to hold our noses and shake our hands and work together. And that's exactly what happened with the Abraham Accords. We saw a lot of uncanny friendships and very unusual alliances being formed between the Arab countries and the Israelis. And that's only because America pulled out. I can promise you, if America was still present in the region, this wouldn't have happened. This is an act of desperation. Another thing we see with the Saudis, they realize that America is no longer dependent on their energy exports, so they don't have their big ticket item seller who they can send their oil barrels to and get cash in return. And not only that, but America's exporting a lot of oil into the global market. And they're not part of OPEC, so they don't engage in these cartels of price fixing. So what does that mean for oil prices going forward? Well, they're historically going to be very low, and Saudi Arabia no longer has the market power to jack up oil prices and reap in the profits. So they quickly went into crisis mode, and they realized, wait a minute, our economy is no longer going to be can no longer be sustainable on oil. So we quickly have to come up with new ways to diversify our economy. Why do you think Saudi Arabia is all of a sudden interested in buying Messi and buying Ronaldo and buying all these sports titles like WWE? Is it because the Saudis all of a sudden became very interested in soccer and wrestling? No. It's because they're trying to diversify their economy away from oil. This is another symptom of America's pullout from the region in tandem with their energy independent status, something the media doesn't pay attention to. The Saudis are behaving this way because they have to. They're just deserts. Saudi Arabia doesn't have anything to offer aside from oil. Many people don't know this, but Saudi Arabia actually even imports their camels from Australia. Look this up. That's how desperate they are for bringing in resources, because they have nothing of their own. They don't even have their own camels, for God's sakes. So that's why they're trying to build this futuristic city you see in the middle, proposing to buy all these Formula One races, trying to open up to tourism and become relevant to tourism and diversify their economy that way, or get TV and licensing rights through soccer and football and all these big name players. This is a symptom of America's absence in the Middle East. Forced peace and economic disinvestment from oil. And this is another implication. We see China stepping in, and China, unlike the US, wants to work with everyone. They don't pick sides. They're working with the Israelis, and under that we see they're working with the Palestinians, they're working with the Syrians, the Iranians, and the Saudi Arabians. The Chinese are very pragmatic in their approach to foreign policy. If you can work with the Chinese and do trade with them, as far as they're concerned, you're their ally and you're their partner. They don't care what your religious, your ethnic, your cultural, or even your geopolitical ideologies are, so long as your trade balance sheet has China on it in the top 3. And that's exactly what China is doing. Just look at the number and the velocity and the frequency of diplomatic missions originating from Beijing and China into the Middle East. It has increased in tandem with America's decline in influence in the region. For some, this might be a concerning development, especially for the West. But for others, this might be a welcomed addition, especially to those players in the Middle East who are trying to change the balance of power. We might be asking ourselves, why is China entering the Middle East? Now, an obvious answer is because America's pulling out, so China's got to step in. But that's a pedestrian answer and doesn't really get to the depth of the issue. At its heart, China, unlike the United States, is not energy independent. That's one of the main reasons why they're interested in the Middle East. They have to import a lot of energy, a lot of oil to sustain their economic machine. That is China. You look on this graph on the right, you see that their biggest oil suppliers of July of last year were pretty much all Middle Easterns. Now you have Russia up there, but let's see it from China's perspective. They see that the war in Russia is not going well. After this war, whenever it will end in the next few years, Russia's probably going to be balkanized. They're very unstable politically. Their economy is in shatters, so they're probably going to be balkanized and broken up into smaller pieces. And even if it does survive and Putin stays in power, there might be a coup from the head of the Wagner group who has tensions with Putin. Who knows? The long story short is Russia can no longer be a long-term reliable partner in energy exports because of the instability that will ricochet in Russia after this war, and is currently starting even. It doesn't even have to start after the war, but you see that after Russia, all their partners in the oil supplier relations business are Middle Easterns. So that is why China is interested in the Middle East. They want a stable Middle East because a stable Middle East means stable oil prices all the way back to Beijing. That's one reason. Another reason is, and this is something I've discussed in my other videos that you can watch in detail, is the Belt and Road Initiative. As you can see on the graph on the left, China is trying to build out this massive trade pipeline and trading infrastructure that allows them to have full access to the markets of the world. And a large part of the Belt and Road Initiative has to go through the Middle East. Roads, pipelines, bridges, everything, even airspace. All of that means that the Middle East has to be stable and functioning and in close relation with China for China to actually go in and implement this plan in full force. That is why China is keen on the Middle East. It's not enough to say that America's pulling out and China steps in. In this channel, we want to look at more detail and more substance to see what the actual reason and incentives are, and these are two primary ones at that. Now, in response to some of the emails and comments I've been getting, which are really good questions, is simply people asking, will this new reality last? A lot of people are skeptical. Well, the deal between Iran and the Saudis sure was brokered by China. Will it last? Will the Americans fully stay out of the Middle East, or will they come back? Will the Chinese continue developing good relations with the other countries, or will they start picking sides and pitting parties against each other to their advantage? You know, there are a lot of factors at play here, and no one has a crystal ball to say, will this new reality that we see with the Chinese chapter in the Middle East last? But what I can tell you is that countries react to incentives. So if we want to predict the future, we have to look at current incentives that brought these players to the places on the chessboard that they currently are at. Starting with Iran. Iran had an incentive to sign this peace deal with the Saudi Arabians because previously they were sending all these weapons and all these arms and all these drones to the Houthis in Yemen, and also there are other groups in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And they were doing it practically for free at no cost because they had political objectives rather than financial incentives. But because of this war in Russia, Russia is actually buying massive amounts of weapons, especially drones, from the Iranians. They're buying them with cash, and they're also buying them by giving Iran fighter jets, MiG fighter jets that the Iranians have been desperate to get their hands on because their air force is a joke. The last top-of-the-line airplanes that they have in their army are F-14 Tomcats left over from the 1970s and the early 80s. So they're desperate to get these fighter jets, and now for the first time they're actually selling these drones and getting money in return. So why give it to the Houthis and the groups that are against Saudi Arabia if they can sell it for a buck? So that incentive is there to continue giving away weapons to regions other than the Middle East. That's Iran's incentive. So long as that remains true, this situation will hold from the perspective of Iran. Let's look at Saudi Arabia. What's their incentive? Well, their incentive is to have more independence and less reliance on the West, and also oil exports, because they know that America is no longer in the region to fully guarantee their security. And in conjunction with that, they know that the oil markets, they're losing power there. They don't have full control and influence. So they're trying to disinvest their economies. And maybe they see that Iran could be a trading partner with them in other goods, and they can also force to come to a peace agreement with Iran so they don't have to spend all this money on military, and instead they could develop other areas of their economy to disinvest from oil, such as tourism, as we saw, or spending all this money on buying the football clubs, the WWE, or whatever they want to do. So long as that assumption and incentive holds true, Saudi Arabia will still act this way as well. Let's look at China. China has an incentive, as I mentioned, to keep the Middle East stable, which means that oil prices will be stable. They want easy access and cheap access to oil. If the Middle East all of a sudden is unstable, there's a lot of wars, that means shipping routes are disrupted. Production of oil is disrupted. And that all are factors that jack up the price of oil and makes the manufacturing sector in China hurt really badly. So China has an incentive to go in and stabilize the region. So again, if that incentive holds true for China, then they will keep doing what they're doing. And lastly, America. Their incentive is they need to be in Europe and then the Pacific. Those are bigger threats in the geopolitical calculus of the Americans than whatever threats that exist in the Middle East. This is not to say that America has zero influence in the Middle East or they're completely disinterested in the Middle East. Actually, quite to the contrary, they most likely, I will predict, come back to the Middle East because China's there now. They're going to come back to deal with the big brother China. But right now, in this current moment, they're distracted. Very few countries, even in World War II we saw, can fight a war on two fronts. And America has to pick their battles. And they've chosen Europe and the Pacific as their two fronts. They can't open a third front, again, because they have inflation, they have political instability at home. Any sort of military presence in the region has been met with backlash both at home and abroad. So America, for the time being, has incentives to be distracted elsewhere. So if all these four assumptions hold true, then yes, this new reality will last, and the situation we see playing out will continue to play out. Now, if you found this video interesting and helpful, I have other videos on my channel that have been getting a lot of views, such as the 4 possible outcomes of Russia's invasion. I made this shortly after the war began, but as you can see in this video, because of the analysis we did here, all the predictions made in this video became true. We predicted that Ukraine and the Scandinavian countries will either begin the process or actually join NATO. That became true, even though some of the comments back then were skeptical, and rightfully so, frankly. I don't blame them, but it turned out to be true. We also said that Russia's not going to have this easy victory. That also became true, and they're going to resort to scorched earth tactics. That became true as well. And if you want to see more predictions or even gain a deeper analysis and insight into what's going on, check out this video and the other ones I have on the channel. Thank you for watching.